All right, everyone. Again, our next group, let's move on to the next discussion. That being project planning, what you know, what you don't know, what you should know. Our group's going to explain how to identify the essential elements of a physical access control system deployment and the different stakeholders that are involved to ensure that they're addressed in the procurement. This ensures you can maintain the security of the facility and minimize the impact on operations when deploying a GSA-approved products listed system. So let's welcome back Lars Suneborn of the Secure Technology Alliance to moderate this discussion.
You thought you got rid of me, huh? All right. First of all, thank you again, and thank you both Mike Kelley and Roger Roehr for that work and effort that you have put into this. And we have talked about different facilities, and we have the Pentagon complex. And the reason we selected the Pentagon complex, among many reasons for that matter, is that it represents so many different aspects. It is a huge facility, both campus and remote site with high rises. You have one system, one access control system that is shared by multiple agencies. You have multiple agencies share one facility with their own access control system integrated. And we have identities that are mapped up in most. We have a very large facility where we have both agency classified information and visitors coming in. So with this, I'll turn it over here to Roger Roehr and Mike Kelley.
Thanks, Lars. Yeah, just for a way of kind of background, I met Mike in 2001. We were both working at actually Department of State on a contract for them when they were first cutting over smart cards and using smart cards for the physical access. Left that project, actually got involved with the writing of the government interoperability smart card standards when that was before the sort of HSP 12 went to Bearing Point. Served as the physical access team leader on the TWIC program. I called Mike up again. I go, you want to play with smart cards and physical access? And he wasn't smart enough to run away from me. We were at Bearing Point for a number of years. I actually joined a manufacturer for a couple of years, and in 2009, I got a call that says, hey, how would you like to do physical security at the Pentagon? And I'm like, sounds interesting. They say, okay, come in for an interview. And I'm like, okay, I don't know what door to go to. It's a big building. And so, little to say, I didn't know what door I was going to go into, and 3 weeks later, I ended up being there. And I think what I had learned up to that point, and what we applied, and I think is very important, is you can't look at this as a procurement of equipment. It is a business process change. So one of the things, the first things I did is, as I was onboarding, I collected all the documents, all the processes, and I wrote down why I was doing what I was doing to come in. I didn't come in saying, hey, we need to put in a PKI reader. We didn't need. I came in to learn a process and to see how we could better enable that process.
Thank you, Roger. Very informative. I'll turn it over to Mike, let you get a brief introduction of your background here too.
Yeah, Roger's already covered most of our background. We've chewed a lot of the same dirt, so a few divergent paths. But one of the things that intrigued me and still to this day impresses me about the Pentagon is just the size and the scope. And if there's a use case to come across, I think we came across it. And just to give you an idea, people think of the Pentagon reservation, and it's not just the Pentagon. The Pentagon Force Protection Agency had not only the reservation itself, but a number of other lease facilities throughout the National Capital Region. So we had a responsibility not just for the reservation, but a whole bunch of other buildings to go along with it. That varied the number varied depending on leases and how many leases were enforced at the time. From a personnel standpoint, when we talked about earlier this morning about assets, people is one of the biggest assets. Well, we're looking at 75,000 permanent party, and we're looking at a peak throughput at one entrance to the building of 5,000 people an hour. So looking at those kinds of numbers, and then you add to that visitors, where we do 250,000 visits a year, and then we also have a permanent party turnover of 30%. So there's a lot of very large numbers here that have to be accounted for as we, move them through this program.
When you have that many visitors and that much turnover, you have to have a huge database someplace. So just to give us a sense of scope here, what number of records or user records were your systems designed to host?
I don't want to get into specifics of the
Okay,
program.
roughly.
I think the bigger point about records and it was funny, as most of you, we had to go through, you get the webinar training and you say, hey, computer security, this. And one of the things that actually came out of that was systems of record notice.
Yes. Yep.
And I think that's a real important one. Mike talked about it earlier in the legal. Make sure you have a systems of record notice and make sure it's up to date and that it's covering everything that you're going to be doing when you transition. Again, looking at this as a business process. That was, that like, hey, that little training bit and there was a bleep in the training bit and then you start following. That turned out to be a pretty big effort. And it wasn't something I was originally aware of. And then how are you going to manage this data? And taking data out of a system is a pretty dangerous thing to do. Most people don't like to do it because, you delete the wrong record. Now you got to go back and recreate that. So there's been sort of a temptation in the past of once in, you're never out. Well, that is probably going to be in violation of your systems of records notice.
So when you have this to be SOR registered, who provided that service? Was that something that was done in-house or was that procured as an outside service?
Generally, it's done in-house, and that's something that the agency has to maintain. It's usually inside counsel. And that can honestly, some of the times, we had a lot of issues with tracking down who was responsible. We were dealing at times with 3 different communications agencies. Then you just start, who's got the, and it turned out in that particular case, one of the interesting things was that it was the public affairs guys that handled it. So, but I'm sure in each agency it's going to be different who handles and manages your systems of record notice. Right. Be aware that you're going to have to deal with that. And if you don't put that into your contract or you're not accounting for it, you could be sitting there, and that could actually be one of the things that holds you up.
Right. Got one more thing on the same topic here. You have one access control system where you have a common entrance, and many agencies' personnel share that. So how did you deal logistically with the agency A owning the access control system and agency B, C, D, and E having their user records in there?
Yeah, I think that was something that was unique for this particular facility. Pentagon Force Protection Agency, by charter, was responsible for the perimeter protection. When you got inside the facility, there was no requirement to actually have one unified PAC system. However, some components within the facilities chose to tie into that system. So we had a mix. We had some people tied into the main system or the perimeter, in which case when they registered in our system,
Mike?
when they registered into our system, they could also be registered and have access to their own individual spaces. Otherwise, it was a 2-step process. They registered to our system for the perimeter, and then they turned around and had to re-register a second time into their own systems. So again, it's really personal, it's organizational preference, and some people like that level of control. They don't want to cede that to anybody else. That's one of the things when you're characterizing your organization that you have to really plan for and understand how you're going to address each one of these spaces.
Yeah, I would even go one further. Start looking at categorizing people and places. So you're really going to come into, everybody thinks about, okay, employees and contractors. You're probably now dealing with actually 2 types of visitors. You're dealing with a PIV credentialed visitor and a non-PIV credentialed visitor. How are you going to manage those? You may even break that down separately to PIV credentialed people in your organization and not PIV'd, or you may even go as far as people in our organization that are government employees will treat one way, contractors will treat another. So start deciding policy-wise how you're going to manage different people, and whether those people be assigned to that facility. What are you going to do if somebody from your own agency comes to that facility? Are you going to automatically give them privileges? I've heard some of that being said. A lot of places won't. So you got to decide, hey, and this again is policy driven and business process. The other thing is, what is the facility? You know, it was interesting. Unfortunately, Derek was one of our government leads that was going to be here. He was talking about he's now over at FDIC. And this sort of gets to he's now got a facility at the Empire State Building. You know, so he's got a whole different thing he's got to deal with that he's not so much targeted as the building is.
Right.
And then he's got a whole procedures and policy to get him in the building, and he doesn't have much control over that. And then he's got procedures and policies to get him into his suite.
Right. So when you talk about all these visitors that are coming, they're both with credentials that was issued from your own agency, in this case DoD, and credentials that you can trust from other agencies and then none. How did you merge that into the access control database? An external visitor management system that you integrated, or was it part of the PACS, or how did you procure those services?
It was definitely external. And we also leveraged the PIV data model, because one of the things in the PIV data model is it tells you what type of person you've got there, you know, whether they're a contractor or what agency they're from and who owns them. So that does allow you to set up some rules about, you know, how you're going to manage those people, and you can automate that to a certain extent.
Right. Do you give PIV cardholder and CAC cardholders the same physical access, or do you differentiate between those?
Well, remember, we one of the things we talked about earlier this morning was the difference between what I use for a credential and who's making that authorization decision and where that decision's made. They are not the same thing. So just because I accept a credential, whether it's a PIV, a CAC, you know, or a bubblegum wrapper, it doesn't matter. I have two different pieces of this process. One is to authenticate the individual, that identity, and then the second is to decide the privileges, and those are two distinct pieces. Mm-hmm. So we actually strove to make sure we separated those processes.
Yeah, one of the things that was kind of a real telling, when I first got there, the access control system could not cache everybody that entered in the building. So this led to a situation where you could literally come up to the turnstile, you could literally be provisioned for the building, and because the memory was out on the panel, your card wouldn't work. So you would show your card to the officer would say, yeah, he just let you in. Because he didn't trust the access control system. The system wasn't basically designed to be big enough to handle that. By the time I left, I actually came back, or one of the last things I did was a 4th of July party. Wasn't even going into the building, just entering a part of the perimeter. And the change was, not only did they have a handheld reader out there, but they wouldn't even let me in until they verified electronically that my credential was good. Right. So there's a whole different process. It's a different thinking. You know, there used to be this thinking of, hey, the badge was good. It was, you know, they didn't question the security of the printing or any of that. It was that you had the right looking badge. Right. And they didn't even really know if the privileges were current or not. Right. To going to the other way, where I don't really trust that you're supposed to be here, even though you have the correct credentials, until I authenticate you.
Right.
So there is a big change in mindset that has to take place on a lot of levels.
When you talk about these visitors and everybody coming through this, a few common entry points, with the amount of visitors that you have processed through there on a per hour basis, especially peak hours, it doesn't take much extra transaction time for everybody before you have lining up in the back of the door. So how did that enter your comparison and your throughput analysis when you had the legacy equipment there, and then when you started to do full PIV certification?
It was a big deal. So to give you an idea of how bad this got, one of the things that they decided is they wanted full height turnstiles. The architect took the vendor's specifications on what the throughput on a turnstile was. Turns out the way the vendor rated the turnstile throughput was the motor spun at 24 RPM. So if you stick somebody in every wedge of that turnstile, you could theoretically get 24 people a minute through the turnstile. Now, anybody who's been in security knows that's totally unrealistic, but that was how the architect designed it. It was funded through Milcon, and it ended up that we had to go back and turn in the money and go for another line of funding in the congressional budget. In the second time around, we had some actual throughput testing where we had an actual turnstile set up. We did the numbers. We actually modeled this in some fire egress software so we knew how bad the backups would be. You know, some of the stuff that you get into particularly is you get these surges, particularly when the subway would come in. So you got to really look at what you're designing and what's going to stress you. And the other side of it is, you know, people sometimes think, oh, lines aren't a big deal. Well, if you look at a lot of the attacks like in Iraq, they're attacking the line. Your line is a security risk. You need to say, hey, how, you know, balance your, you know, your balanced security of getting people through versus how deep you authenticate them. Or do you have to put more places for them to authenticate?
So if you have to put more turnstiles in there, that could potentially lead to redesign of the lobby.
Not only that, but, and I, you know, again, we get into, some of these were controlled, they're National Planning Commission, NCPC.
Yeah,
Yeah.
National Capital
Planning
Planning Commission.
Commission, so it had to go through review boards and architectural boards and stuff like that. So, yeah, it's really important to have your process designed and define what it's going to be and understand what it's going to do. Because you could be spending a lot of money going back, you know, and like I said, they hired a very reputable architecture firm. The architect who did that turnstile calculation just didn't even ask twice. They just said, hey, what's your throughput? And that was a design that was done even before I got there, and it was almost 6 or 7 years before those turnstiles were put in. So that's how long these things can take.
Yeah, I think the big lesson there is, especially if the bigger the scale, is don't just take everything at face value. Find a way to validate as much as you can, smaller, lower risk, whether it's a slow rollout, lab testing, modeling. Do as much as you can to verify the assumptions that you're making before you put these things into production and find out these lessons the hard way. And start disenfranchising customers, because as soon as you start doing that, you're going to start to lose faith in the system. People won't trust the system. We'll be back to what Roger was describing earlier, where, well, we know the system doesn't work, go ahead and we're just going to use a flash pass and let you in the building until the system catches up.
Right.
You don't want to lose the faith in that system.
So now that, excuse me, now that it comes to the point where you may have to do some fairly significant architectural changes to what you have, you just don't go to the local security people or to the security managers and say, hey, we're going to need more funding for this. You have to have buy-in. So how far up the food chain did you get to get buy-in for your project and what you were actually trying to accomplish here?
As far up as you can. Actually got invited to the Senior Identity Protection Coordination, had the Deputy DOD CIO come down and brief the agency leadership. You can't emphasize enough finding somebody that understands what you're doing at a very senior level, or somebody that you educate to say, hey, go forth. The other thing is just plain old public outreach. You can't do enough of it. We made videos, we made posters, we made basically PowerPoints that were put up on kiosks. We went to the graphics people and actually had a logo designed and branded. One person's job at one point for almost 2 years was just about public outreach.
Yeah.
And the other piece of this, don't be afraid of feedback. You know, engage your stakeholders honestly and make that cast that net as wide as you can. The more feedback, the more people you have involved in terms of giving you ideas, what's going to work, what's not going to work, when you're looking at it from different perspectives in terms of impact on operations and how you're gonna migrate things, that feedback is invaluable. And it can keep you from making some serious mistakes. So when you're looking at your team, look for some honest brokers to give you feedback from different perspectives. And making sure you have those types of people on your team, I think that's also invaluable.
Right. And to get this kind of buy-in and support from top leadership in this and common other cases here too, you have to be clear when they ask, why are you doing this? What is it we're trying to protect here? So I'm sure that you have to have a list of assets. So what were considered the primary asset that you went to top leadership to get buy-in for this?
Well, and this goes back to what I was talking about this morning. It's beyond just saying we have to comply. So the different spaces, you have spaces with classified information. You have places with personnel information or contracts or financial, and I mentioned those this morning. You may have drugs or weapons or different kinds of critical infrastructure. Look at spaces inside your facilities that have things like critical infrastructure for heating, ventilation, air conditioning, networks, power. All those types of spaces have different types of risks, and that's where you go through. And the more of those risks that you can quantify and demonstrate, that's going to make it easier for you to get your support. It's got to go beyond regulation and compliance.
Yeah, if you just look at it as checking the box, hey, I got an APL approved system, you're not going to make it. And I mean, that's actually been seen in some other installations. They slammed in an APL system. It took too long. It backed people out the door, and it got shut down. You have to make it a business process. It has to be that the system supports the people, that not the people complying and conforming to the system, because at some point, what will happen is somebody will say, hey, tear it out. Looked a lot at, example, a lot of this stuff we talk about in the APL covers basically transactions at the door. Nothing really covers, hey, how do I securely get this person in? How do I securely say they should be privileged? Nothing looks at what kind of digital signatures that should be put on a request for access. Those aren't out there, but yet, if I sit here and I say, hey, I'm going to put this great PKI reader on a door, but yet the way that door gets privileged is it just sends some sort of an unsecure email to the security director, then that's your weak link.
Right.
If you don't look at it as a whole, as a business process, you really are probably not going to get a very functional system, if one that functions at all.
Right. And you have to come into there, the agency and individual reputation too. It says, well, this is the last site we're going to attack because we will probably not survive an attack on this. We have to do someplace else. So kind of reputation there too would be at stake. So now you have all of this, and you're going to come here and you're getting support from your top management, and they're going to say, well, we have all these access control systems out there. We have all of this stuff. Why can't we do it with what we have?
It really depends on what you have. I mean, you may be able to do it with what you have. You may be able to do it with what you have with extra licensing. You may be able to do it with what you have plus hardware. That's again, the whole title of the session: what you know, what you don't know, and what you need to know. And I think from a procurement person, those you're starting to hear, if you're not hearing this language and somebody is saying, hey, I want to buy this, then probably what you know is that you need to start hiring somebody that's going to develop these questions and ask them for your facility and is going to look at your facility. I don't know what your expertise at your facility is. You know what your expertise at your facility. And that's really the important thing is, you can almost approach this, and I don't even want to play a procurement person. God bless Lynn, she wants to be GSA superhero. That whole whether you want to design right now, you want to design build, or you just want to build. What we see as an industry is we see a lot of stuff where they're saying, hey, I don't want to pay for design. Design's expensive. The reason design's expensive and good designs are very expensive is it's an iterative process with expensive people. You don't get the junior guy out there who has the experience that's going to come in there and sit there with you and look at everything you got, and it's not going to be cheap, and it's hard. What you'll at the end of the day is show paper. If you put a new reader on the door, you put a new widget, that's pretty easy to say, hey, yeah, we got it, we checked the box, and we're done. But at the end of the, if you come back in 6 months and you're not using the widget, you really haven't done yourself that good of a favor. What we see a lot is widget procurement without a whole lot of design.
Right, so that design and what you need to procure, that comes from what you were talking about here, the analysis with this is what we can do with this, and this is what we need to do.
Right. And the other one, and Mike talked about this, who's your AHJ? Authority having jurisdiction. Classical physical access control, the number one guy you had to worry about was the fire marshal. That was your number one guy you had to worry about. And that varies from location to location, facility to facility. Some places, you got exclusive jurisdiction. One of the easiest places I ever worked was a museum. They had exclusive jurisdiction of that museum. They had one guy that was in charge of all the fire, and basically he would lock people in fires. He didn't care. He didn't want the art getting out. I've been in other places where it's a mix. They'll work with you, and I've been jurisdictions where the fire marshal says, if you don't bring me an approved plan, I'm not going to let you build it. And then you ask him, well, what do I need to change? And he goes, you're the expert. Go figure it out.
That's helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good takeaway. The fire marshal, the local fire marshal, is one very important person, and he or she can say, you don't occupy this building until you put some exit panic hardware on there that I approve, and that go from in the same city from fire marshal and fire district to another. And you had what? How many districts and how many jurisdictions? You covered several states.
No, it was 3 states plus the District of Columbia.
Yeah.
But 85, I think, on average, is probably 85 facilities total across those jurisdictions. So, and then when you go down into the, local levels, into the towns, townships, and what have you, that number went up even more as far as number of people we had to deal with.
Yeah. And then, like, you get to certain cities like Chicago, you got to put everything in conduit. It's local electric code.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So now you have this, and then you have a whole lot of regulatory requirement. We talked a little bit about that then. So what contracts and what procurement vehicles did you use for this? There must have been a little bit of everything.
Yeah, it actually started out, they used some stuff from Huntsville, small business, but primarily where we finally ended up was Schedule 70, SIN 13262. And so we got the expertise for that, and you had the qualification for SIN 13262.
So that covers both the services, such as what we talked about, the gap analysis, and then some of the hardware that you were buying.
That's correct.
Okay. And then
Now, there was other vehicles used, and this is another really good one. There was a whole nother contractor involved in IT, another contractor involved in installing the actual packs. We were doing the identity management. So you guys are going to have to manage multiple contractors that are trying to eat each other's dog food.
that was pretty graphic. Thank you.
It sometimes gets that bad too.
Right. So those services, they were procured from outside sources, you're saying, or was some of it that was provided in-house?
So there was some of the stuff was the agency's own, contracts. Some of the contracts were held by other organizations within DOD. And then, you start getting into, say, it's a leased GSA facility, then you've got that going on too,
Right.
And then you got a landlord-tenant situation.
Right, my favorite example of requiring coordination, we actually had 2 facilities linked with a piece of fiber optic cable, and we had 2 different organizations controlling each end of that same piece of fiber. So, that kind of detail and that kind of coordination, and you need to understand what level you need to go down to make that coordination, to make these projects come off without a hitch.
Right.
And they both had their own contractors.
Yeah.
Right. Well, so now you've gotten to the point where you have done your buy-in, you got your budgets, you have done the gap analysis, and now you're going to start looking at what actually do we need, and you have your risk assessment here. And you have all kinds of conflicting vectors going in here. You have something where public has access, and you have something where you have classified information up to TS and beyond. So how did you deal with the risk assessment and the facility security level, and what's behind each one of these doors?
Well, let's separate risk assessment from facility security level first, because we talked about this morning a little bit, and
Yep.
the IAC standard, up to the point that it addresses right now, is fantastic. To get into, a fairly easily understandable methodology to determine your risk to your facility as a whole. But it doesn't help you for access control internally. So I just want to make sure we understand that. When you're starting to get into the spaces, just like we talked about this morning, knowing what assets you have, knowing what spaces they're in, knowing what you need to do to protect those based on the risks of those assets, and what the impact on the organization and the mission will be if you had a compromise of that particular asset. If I've got a relatively critical asset, but I have several ways to get it throughout the facility, then maybe it's not as critical for me because my impact is low. But knowing where those assets are, whether it's material, equipment, people, information, whether it's paper information or computer information, data, knowing where that information is and how it's protected and what the risk is that's really essential for all this. And when you have a multi-tenant facility, such as we had, 26 DoD components, knowing who the people were to be able to go in and talk to those people and say, if you want to work together, we need you to help us identify those assets and know what your requirements are.
So there was stakeholders from many different organizations,
Yes.
and they were all part of your project team that you're now beginning to form.
Yeah, and some of it wasn't necessarily a formal part of, regular part of the project team. They would come in and out depending on where we were in the process. So we needed help identifying the assets within their spaces to help them define what they want to protect. Some of them, like I said earlier, some of them said, sorry, we're going to handle this on ourselves. You get us in the building and we'll take our own space and don't worry about it. You don't need to know what's inside the next door. That's fine. We can do it that way.
Yeah.
If you want us to help and work with you, that's how we're going to have to do it.
Right. So one of the points here is that you don't need to know exactly what's behind that door. That's something that the space owner security people can deal with on their own.
There's two solutions, right? And at the end of the day, it comes down to time and budget, right? How much money do I have, and how much money does the person I'm trying to help? Maybe I have a way to save them money also, maybe I don't. And maybe they're willing, maybe they aren't. Maybe they have a sufficient budget to take this on themselves and not need to leverage it, okay?
Right.
Do you have a question? So you're asking about what would be the best contract vehicle to use? Oh, geez, you're asking the wrong guy. I mean, honestly, at the end of the day, what happens is, firm fix is what most everything I've seen come out. And that's usually because they just got to control the price. If you can do a T&M not to exceed. That may, if you're just going for design, that may be a real good way to go. What happens with firm fixed, quite honestly, being on the other side, is you always put fluff in it to somebody asked earlier today, do I need a walkthrough or is the plans good enough? The simple answer is the plans may be good enough, but I'm probably going to put more risk on it. So if I have more risk, that ends up being more cost to the government. So, on the other side, if you run into something, you just say, hey, I don't know, I don't understand. You may start with small T&M and then look at going into a firm fix. Steve.
Okay.
I've always wanted to know because, I haven't been to the Pentagon in like forever. First off, nice job on the panel. Thank you very much. But how do you get 5,000 people through on the metro entrance and actually identify and authenticate them?
Wouldn't you like to know? And you're not going to know.
All right.
What kind of decisions did you make?
Would you be able to repeat your question for our YouTube audience?
Sure. So, good job on the panel. I'm enjoying this a lot. But the big question to me has always been, how do you get those 5,000 people through at the metro entrance? And, how do you identify and authenticate them? And
Well, we're not
do
going to
the
go
right
down
thing?
that path, Steve, and for obvious reasons. The thing is that you have to design your facility, and this is what it really gets down to, and then maybe you have to go back to get funding like we did to increase the entrances. And that's the thing you've got to do is decide what level you're going to authenticate those people, and then what is that going to require? And that actually required a very significant amount of funding, and that's, ongoing.
All right. There was a different question there, I thought.
Sir, do you have the
Okay.
mic? Sir, do you have something?
Yeah, I got a second question. What obstacles do you come across as far as multiple tenants/agencies when you're trying to put them all on the same system?
The biggest thing to me that we experienced from my perspective is a policy procedural issue. All right, so knowing that knowing exactly communicating between you and your tenants, knowing what's going to be required for them to get into the building, knowing when they have the ability to get into the facility, out of the facility, those types of things. That coordination, I think, is the biggest challenge. Remember, if they actually subscribe and let us help them, they also got rid of the responsibility of monitoring, responding to. They let us take care of that piece for them. So that was a huge burden administratively and procedurally off their shoulders. But making sure that they had that peace of mind that they could control access, the authorization into their space without any of the other overhead involved. And that kind of coordination, I think, was the biggest challenge for us.
I had a little bit of a challenge in that sometimes people had to be read into programs. And making sure that the people that were on the administrative side were actually read into some of the programs. And again, it was always about how audits and who's doing the data.
Right.
Jordan?
So question from online from Lauren. What would you recommend the government do to streamline and improve coordination among the various contractors?
That is really going to come down to your core, right? Your core has to sort of be in there and understand that, hey, everybody's in it to make some money. What's a reasonable fee, and how do I write the contract so that they manage with each other? And defining the lines, and usually a lot of times it comes down to who's going to be responsible at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think defining the roles and responsibilities is by far the most important issue there. If you go in one direction, you have a gap where each contractor may think somebody else is doing something, and then when a schedule slips or there's a budget overrun, you're all pointing the fingers at somebody else. Conversely, you'll have multiple contractors responsible for the same thing, and you have this overlap. So if you don't identify clearly those roles and responsibilities up front, and I think that's the most important thing that you can do to get that that interaction and that coordination going.
Right. And I think you hit it right on there. Responsibilities assigned right from the front. And then when everyone, all the different stakeholders have had their portion of responsibility leading their group, then when the task is completed, an official sign-off procedures that our piece, this detail of this project is now done. Go to the next. Okay. Questions? We've got some good questions here already.
I think one of the things, just kind of, don't bite too much off. You were asking about, what contract you use and what. If you're not sure, do as small as you can for, very narrow defined scope. So if you're not sure, do a small, maybe T&M design. The thing is if you try to bite off too much, then your senior leadership, like we said, is going to be like, hey, you aren't doing anything. So make sure you have that senior leadership and you do produce at the end of the day. That's going to be important.
Right. You touched on something there, Roger. That is one thing to gain and achieve the senior leadership support in the beginning.
Right.
Then you got to keep it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and another part of keeping it is not just breaking this into small, measurable, successful pieces, but also when you go to do your deployments, make sure you have strategies as you roll out these pieces. How are you going to test this in advance so that you're reasonably sure you're going to succeed? And then when you get to that point where you're actually rolling this out, what happens when everything goes south? What are your rollback plans? What are your recovery plans? How do you restore operations? And how has this been communicated to your customers, to your population? Most of the time when we would roll out a new capability, new section, new facility, in addition to doing the common sense, the backups and those types of checks, we would close a facility on a Friday afternoon, send everybody home. We'd start doing the cutover, and then say if we hadn't gotten to where we need to be by Saturday, we'd start rolling back so that when everybody came back Monday morning, all we had to say, sorry, we had to postpone the rollout, but your operations are not impacted. You could still come in and work. And that kind of confidence that instilled in senior leadership and communicating the expectations up front really helped us to keep that support.
Yeah, telling your senior leadership on Saturday evening instead of Monday morning that you're going to be at a certain place is a lot better.
Right. Very good. Communication, in other words, communication. When you select all your vendors or your contractors and everything else, all the people that are involved there, do you have any prerequisites when you come to selecting both companies and people and the various organizations?
Work with your friends for like 20 years.
That's a good prerequisite.
The only bad thing about that is they'll tell stories about your earlier life and flying objects.
Well, let's not go there, but if there are no further questions, ladies and gentlemen, let's gather back together for our final panel at 2:15 p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you all, panelists.